Another week, another going nowhere for us. And we have another guest today. Aydin, thank you for joining us
Yeah, thanks for
for
having me.
today's podcast.
Glad,
Yes.
glad to be here.
I'd like to ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself if you want to kick us off.
Sure. Yeah, sure. So my name is Aydin. I currently live in Belgium, which is also the country where I'm born. I don't like to say I'm from Belgium or I am Belgian. Like I don't necessarily subscribe to any one given country. But so yeah, I live here currently with my wife. We renovated our house here a couple of years, over the past couple of years, and currently I've been, I would say, active in sales for the past 10 years. So I'm on the dark side of the force, some would say. And yeah, very, very glad to be here and talk to you guys about life and love and whatnot.
Yeah. So you're writing a book at the moment. Have you got a title and what's it about?
Yeah, I am. Thanks for the opportunity to humble brag about it, which is what
Yeah,
we
go
what
for
we
it.
love to do. No, so yeah, I've been trying to write a book, I would say, for the past 4 years. Like it started as a blog post where I wanted to very humbly share my operating principles on how I viewed the world and how I interacted with people and built relationships and those types of things. Because I thought I had it all figured out on how to live well and build relationships well. I was very naive. Like once you then start actually trying to write something more than, a few scrolls on a smartphone and you actually start to write like 20, 30 pages on like a deep subject, trying to unravel and deconstruct your own view on life and operating principles and what you think makes you happy, you start to notice that you don't know much and that the belief system or the value system that you may have doesn't really make that much sense, which was for me the case. Which, the things that I thought made me a content and happy person, once you start to unravel them, were very superficial, even though I thought they were deep and meaningful. And so that's the stuff I've been writing about then for the past 4 years now. It's been very therapeutical as well for me personally, and the rabbit hole keeps getting deeper and deeper. But I've been enjoying it very much, and it's been a very good conversation starter as well with people. Maybe this is a good example of it. And sorry, I didn't answer your question. Well, what is the title? Like the working title currently is called "Free from Ambition." So it tries to so the first question that I try to unravel is, do we need ambition in life? And then from there, rather than trying to give the answer, I try to look for what is the next best question if you ask that question. So it's been an interesting journey so far. So I said, so the first question in the book that I try to ask and not answer is, do we need ambition? And what I try to do is I try to uncover what is the next best question to ask rather than trying to come up with an answer to the question.
So what is the next best question to ask?
Yeah, that's the good question to ask. Well, I think, it's a very layered question, right? Do we need ambition? Because it includes a few things. Like it talks about the need, like the desire. It talks about, do we need? So who is the we? Who is the I? And then obviously you have to try and uncover what is ambition itself. Like what is the definition of that? So I think in order to answer the question, do we need ambition? There's probably like 20 more questions underneath. Now, more interestingly, in the whole book, people that have been like proofreading some stuff like do get annoyed with the fact that I don't give any answers. Because we're all conditioned and educated into thinking in duality and thinking in answers, input and output. And people get a bit, annoyed is not a good word, but maybe a bit uncomfortable or uneasy when you keep asking question after question without actually giving any conclusion or finality to it. So that's a challenge that I've been trying to work on with the book. But yeah, to not answer the question, what is the next possible question? Let me turn it around. What do you guys think? Like when you try to unravel the question, do we need ambition? Like what comes to mind as a possible next question that you need to think about? No right or wrong answers, by the way. Only good questions.
Putting us on the spot here. I think we need to start from the foundation of asking if ambition is always positive, for example, because I think ambition can be positive, but in today's world it has become a little bit of a has turned into a hustle culture a little bit, of people trying to achieve through overworking or constantly working in that way and trying to get somewhere, and it's not always, I think, fulfilling and not something for everyone. For example, I don't think you can make everyone happy.
Right.
So I do think you need to establish a few things.
Yeah, that's true. No, that's true. And I think it's a very recognizable reflex as well to say like some ambition and maybe a lot of ambition is good and is positive in the world. I think it also comes down to, what do we define as ambition? Is ambition mainly are we talking about the connotation with, the professional world and the workplace and trying to get ahead and all that stuff? Or is ambition, and, in the book I try to widen it up and say, look, ambition is any desire to achieve, something new, to attain, to become something better, or to keep something that you've already attained. Like that can be a desire, a goal, or an ambition as well, which can be love, which can be status, which can be inner peace, security, all those types of things. And so I try to, use that context, let's say, as a very broad spectrum to then uncover on a maybe psychological level, but more maybe a physical and a biological level, like what feeds into that behavior to try and keep things that, make us feel secure, try to attain things that give us security through identity or through any other form of goals. Because
that
some things are
grasping on.
Sorry, go ahead, John.
Yeah, so that grasping on, I guess, can also actually hinder any maybe pure ambition, if there is such a thing as a good ambition. Grasping on and not take risks, perhaps, means that we actually we can't achieve or go where we're meant to go, or would be a good place to go.
No, that's I think that's a good point. Like, it's maybe a challenge to try and decouple it from seeing certain things as being productive or not, because I think if you look through the lens of categorizing or splitting up certain forms of ambition and trying to uncover why certain ambitions are good and why certain are bad, then I think you're not looking at a very deep level of our behavior and what drives, us trying to pursue certain things. In a way, you can always flip around an ambition as well. So if you say, I want to be happy, or I want to be at peace, you can flip it around by saying, if you want to be happy, you're actually in fear of not being happy. Or if you want to have inner peace, you could flip it around and say you actually want to be less anxious. And if you follow that kind of, let's say, thought process, you could imply that any form of ambition, whether it has a positive or a good output, is always rooted in fear, because we try to do it to avoid feeling bad. If you want to feel happy, it sounds like something noble, something good. Or if you want to make someone else feel happy, essentially you want them to not feel happy, which is operating from a position of fear or anxiety. And so without then classifying good and bad ambition, it's maybe more interesting just to try and look a level deeper and say, like, why do we operate from a position of fear? So that could be like the next question. If you want to answer, do we need ambition? Like, if we were to come to the conclusion that indeed any ambition is rooted in fear, why does the brain operate in a way that we operate from a position of fear all the time? Could be a next question.
Did you think we're...
Well, if
you go ahead.
Go on, John. No, you go on.
I was just going to ask, do you think that fear is something which is inherent in humanity, or is it something that society shoves down our throats somehow, directly or
That was
indirectly?
kind of what I was going to ask. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a fair question. It touches on a lot of different things, right? Then you have to try and define what is society, right? Is society something external that imposes stuff on people, or is it that the people make the society? And is the people peopling the society? And in a sense that if we're fearful on the inside, that's what the society is going to reflect? Or can we just blame the external thing, the society, as something separate from us? And is that something that needs changing and reforming in order for us to feel less fearful and anxious? That's probably the question.
Yeah, well, it's a chicken or egg, I guess, or not necessarily in time, but in terms of the society is made up of people, and but then you can say that doesn't mean that if you change, that other people are going to also change, or there might be a lag in terms of previous things that we've done collectively cause problems for the society several years into the future, which means it's hard to recover.
Yeah, I think that's a fair observation. So, you could say there's some sort of abstract distance between us and us as a person and then the society, the external thing that is out there. There seems to be some sort of distance, whether that's in space or in time, as you say, in the future, the society might be impacted by what we do today. Maybe the question is like, is that in reality a thing, or is that like maybe some sort of abstraction that the mind creates to make sense of it all? If that makes any sense. I want like maybe put it differently, like, take away the people and there is no society, right? Which is your point, like the chicken and the egg. Like you can't have one without the other. But that's not entirely true, because if you take away the idea of society, the people are still there. The same relationships are still there. The cause and impact is still there without the abstraction
Yeah,
or
I would
the
call that
word
real
society.
society.
Okay.
Well, yeah, like I would say if you take away that, then you still got society, but it's just in a
Right.
more maybe a pure form, whereas it's somehow
Right.
different. It's still you could define society as a group of people. Like as long as there's
Right.
some sort of interactions between those people, then that still meets some of the definition of society.
I think it's a little bit of both, I think, in terms of human nature and society shaping our ambition. I think everyone a little bit wants to improve themselves and their circumstances as much as they can, but I also think society is putting a lot of socioeconomical pressures as well on us to kind of make more money, get more things, consume as well, which I think plays in a lot of people's minds, and they try to get more money one way or another because money is equal to success almost a little bit these days, I think. Or that's what it means, I think, for a lot of people.
In the West, yeah. Well, yeah, I think
In the West, yeah.
entirely true. Although, what we let's try and uncover what we mean when you, for example, say society puts certain pressure. That's in the basis. That's saying, other people put certain pressure, or the expectations that other people have of me, or the expectation, or the thought that I have of the expectations of other people that they might have of me, right? Because essentially we don't know what the other people want of us. It's always the perception that we have and the reflection that we have of the world, right? That's the only thing we know. So in a sense, what we say, this pressure that society puts on us is a reflection of what we think the expectation of society is and the pressure that they put on us, which is the same as saying, if everyone does this at scale, we're putting the expectation of the other on ourselves, right? There is no external pressure or expectation. It's always what we think the expectation of the other person is. Or is that maybe too black and white?
Yeah, but I do think that what we think is often also true. I mean, a lot of people have their parents' expectations of them to, make a lot of money, make a lot of things for themselves. And if you even don't take that, if you take men, for example, society expects men to be the breadwinners. Society expects men to make the most money in most cases to, to be able to support the family very often. So I do think there are societal pressures there.
Yeah, and a lot of cultures that's still the case. In the West, it's probably turning. I don't think half of the population would agree with that, in the sense, that the half of the population, or at least half, doesn't necessarily want the man to be the big breadwinner in the family. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying probably in the West that's turning around a little bit. But there's many other cultures and groups of people where that's still the case, or the expectation. That's true. But at least, yeah, it's a vicious circle, right? In trying to ask like who puts the expectation and who tries to follow it.
Do you think there is a difference between, healthy ambition and pursuit of, improvement and, obsession with like overachieving, for example?
Depends on what you're asking. Like, if the question is there a difference biologically speaking? I don't think so. In the sense that I think it's the same mechanism. It might have like different strengths or something like that, but I think underlyingly the mechanism is still the same. I think it all stems from a desire for something, right? A desire for psychological safety, whatever you want to call it, even though I don't think that necessarily exists, the whole psychological safety thing. But whatever it is, whether you're obsessed with achieving certain things and certain goals, or you just want to have a peaceful life, I think that the mechanism that drives both desires, I think, is the same thing, potentially, if you look at it more deeply. And then, we go back to the initial point of like, is all ambition rooted in fear? Like, it might not be the case. I think from what I've been writing and reading, I think it very likely it does. And then whether you're trying to, get ahead at work at all costs and you walk over other people, or you're just trying to be the most noble activists to fight climate change and save the world. I think underlyingly, that person trying to save the planet also operates from a position of fear because they don't want the planet to go to waste and the next generations, etc. And the warlord that tries to, sell drugs and kill people and win land also operates from a position of fear because he wants to feel secure by doing the things that he or she does in a position of malice. So I think it's the same mechanism from what I've seen so far. Feel free to disagree, by the way.
Well,
Yeah,
what about people who want to achieve to help others, for example? Not so much of fear for themselves, but people that want to be successful in order to help family, in order to help other people, like for altruistic motives, let's say.
Right. Yeah, it's a fair question. Like, do altruistic people also operate from a position of fear? Is a fair question. I remember a moment, this is like 15, 20 years ago. I was in a cab in Shanghai with a colleague. I think this was my first job, first time traveling abroad for work. And I remember us talking, and I was saying something along the lines of like, what makes me happy is making other people happy, which sounded like a very noble thing to say. And I think at the time I felt quite good about myself for saying it because it sounded wise beyond my years and stuff. But it touches the question, like, that type of mindset, does it also operate from a position of fear? Do people that are altruistic and that want to help other people, are they also operating from a position where they don't want other people to feel bad? So are they in some sort of subconscious anxious state where they don't want people to feel pain or feel hurt, and by making them feel better, they make themselves feel better, which again might be the exact same mechanism at work as if they were not doing it for other people. Like, question mark, like, again, feel free to disagree, but so far for me, and maybe I've been in it for too long, it always loops back to the same basic mechanism of we want to feel secure, and some will do it through identity, others will do it by wanting to make the world a better or safer place. But even doing that, even wanting to save the planet and making other people feel better, might be some sort of primal mechanism that just wants to avoid living in a state of conscious or subconscious fear, potentially.
But do you think the constant pursuit of ambition in order to secure a more safe environment for you is always pushing someone to do more instead of try and step back and be content with themselves, for example, and find, some fulfillment in themselves instead of always pursuing something outside of them?
It's a fair question, but I would say, or I would ask the question, like, isn't trying to be more content the same as wanting to achieve something more, let's say, more externally? Wanting to be content is wanting to be less anxious, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I would say that if you're content, you're not anxious, you're not stressed, you're not fearful, you feel
being content or being at peace. Some might say the opposite is, being anxious, being stressful. You could also look at it as being stressful or being anxious as some sort of spectrum, as being on a scale. And either you're very anxious and very stressful, or you're, the opposite of the spectrum, very less anxious and less stressful. And some say, the opposite of being anxious or stressful is being at peace. Another way of looking at it is that you're always on the spectrum of being anxious or stressful. And if you say, I'm at peace, you could also say you're simply being less anxious. And in a way, you could try and, and this is, then it becomes a very philosophical idea. Maybe the opposite, maybe being at peace doesn't have an opposite. Maybe either you're at peace or you're something completely else and you're on the spectrum of just being anxious, but just being, very, very less anxious or a little anxious, whatever you want to call it. So, Yeah, it's an interesting one, but um, in any case, trying to be more at peace or less, let's say, attached to the materialistic world that usually is, linked to being ambitious, is still a way of achieving something more, even if it's, trying to achieve something less. If you want to achieve less, you're trying to achieve more of the lesser things.
Mm.
Makes any sense?
Yeah, I can understand that. I can understand that how, by achieving something, you're trying to, achieve a state of contentment in a way.
Mm,
But I'm just still concerned that when we say that people will always think that contentment is always linked to getting something else
mm,
rather than, what if you already have all the things you were dreaming of, let's say, at one
right.
point or another. I'm sure we all have goals and ambitions where you're going to reach that stage, and then it will not be enough. You'll still be fearful that, oh, you might lose that. For example, you might lose all you've gained now, and
Right.
then, and then that puts you back into the race, in my mind
Yeah.
at least.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
then you'll never stop. How can you say that by keep searching for ambition, you'll end up in a more contentment and fulfilled life like that?
Just, I think it's an interesting question. I think the reflex that we have is, trying to find that answer, and I think that's again that desire to find the answer is the same mechanism, right? So it's the same type of trying to become more, trying to achieve more, become something else. So I would again argue, what is the next question then? If the point is like, rather than maybe asking how, you know, do we become content without being ambitious, is maybe reversing the question and saying like, why aren't we content by achieving more? Because if you look at the world, we've probably, we're at a stage, as a species, as a society, where we haven't achieved more than in the past thousands of years, and we haven't been as secure as we are now. So we are like in a prime ambitious state, and no one is really less anxious or less happy. So like, why is that? This is maybe a good question. Like, why are we still fearful? Why are we still chasing something that we know will not do it? It won't bring us peace or freedom, whatever it is, and we still keep doing it. So you have to ask why. Like, and maybe it's a biological thing, right? Maybe the brain is hardwired in a way that it perpetuates the problem. And then the question is, well, if that's the hypothesis, it's not the answer to the question. Like, it's a hypothesis. Maybe the brain is hardwired to keeping us chase our own tail, even though we know intellectually it doesn't actually work, and we know it's not a matter of finally finding that one thing on the wish list that isn't, that's not going to do it. We know that's not going to happen. So if that's the hypothesis, and maybe the brain is hardwired to perpetuate a problem, the next question could be, why does the brain do that? Why does the brain why is the brain set up in such a way that it tries to keep us ambitious, even though it knows it also brings about struggle, comparison, all those things that we know do not make us happy? Is it just part of the game? Being having struggle and
Well,
comparison,
it's
or
I would
is it?
argue it doesn't
Go ahead.
it doesn't occur for children so much. They're certain below a certain age, it seems like ambition just suddenly skyrockets at a certain point and then stays there for a lot of people.
Oh, that's an interesting point.
So,
But what do you mean with
so if
ambition then, if you would have to define it? Because is it comparison? Do you mean that kids don't compare as much as adults, or that they don't have goals? What do you mean?
yeah, I guess they don't have sort of goals which are far off. So they might have an immediate goal of I want to climb up that climbing frame,
Right.
or I want to chase that thing, but they won't. Yeah, the maximum time for that goal would probably only be a day or two at max.
Mm,
Yeah, it's about yeah, I'd
mm.
say that, and then the comparison comes in relation to those sort of goals.
Yeah. And then is your point that they simply have a shorter ambition span, but they still are ambitious, or that they're not ambitious in the way that people are, or like adults are, kids are people too?
I would say there's no I involved so much for the kids. It's more it's not trying to accumulate badges or whatever.
Mm,
It's a direct I see it, but there's no like, I involved. There's just you see something
mm,
and then you engage with it. It's just then it's a spontaneous.
But by saying this, maybe you can say that this stems from the fear of failure again. Sorry, I think I don't know if I cut out myself this time there.
I think we're losing John.
Okay.
Every
I
once
don't
in a
know.
while.
Our connection is really bad tonight. I don't know what is happening.
Yeah, it's maybe the
No, but I was
riverside.
saying, if we take it, Aydin's hypothesis, that it all stems from the feelings of fear that people have. Maybe these feelings of fear start at a certain point, the fear of failure, for example, of not getting those badges, of not getting the success, and therefore that drives the motive to succeed,
Yeah,
Yeah.
could be. I think so. We as a species, the human beings. Yeah, I think you're back, John.
Can hear you.
The question was right, like, we were asking is there a difference between kids and adults in the way that they go about ambition? I think, Dinos, you were making a point.
I do wonder if at some point, kids feel quite safe, feel quite protected up until a certain point where they start going to school, where they start being in an environment where they don't control a lot of things that happen, and where they're being asked to perform very often and succeed. And the fear of losing and not succeeding starts driving that ambition, which then, as John said, maybe persists for everyone until they die.
No, that's a fair question. Well, I think like certain animals, when they come into the world, they come for a very large part, they come pre-programmed with a lot of instinct and habits and behavior. I think humans are on the opposite of the spectrum. We come into this world with a very plastic brain that doesn't actually do anything, can't do anything. We're very helpless when we come into the world. And I think it takes a long while before we actually start asking questions. We're the only animal on the planet, as far as we know, that can actually question things. There's a lot of animals that can ask for things. A monkey can ask for a banana, but the monkey doesn't question where the banana comes from. And I think it's the same with kids. At one point, they come to a state that they have a brain that is evolved largely enough that it can actually question things. And maybe that's the point where they also ask, like, well, how do I fit in this hierarchy of other, kids with snot and diapers and all that stuff? And maybe that's the point where for them ambition comes in the same sense that we experience it. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, maybe. I think that's a good point. I think that could potentially be the case.
Yeah. Like you could ask the question, like, is it an educational thing? Like, are we educated into comparison and ambition? Or is it that it's always the case that the brain is actually, the iteration that we have of this brain, which has been around for 200,000-300,000 years, that it is hardwired to at one point, be evolved after birth to a state where it will always start to question things and that it will always create this sense of identity as maybe a survival mechanism. Like maybe having a sense of self is
I was just going to say that it's probably natural selection at play there. In some cases, non-ambitious people would have probably been weeded out of the gene pool long time ago because they weren't ambitious enough to make sure they built the spear long enough to kind of hunt. So I think, there is a lot of evolutionary pressures that have shaped our brains as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's not so much that the brain, that natural selection, prefer ambitious people. It's just that random mutation at that point created a sense of self, which then created ambition. And as you say, like that's advantageous from a survival perspective. Like if you have a brain that is fueling the idea that there's an I and that I needs to be added to and needs to be improved, that's good for survival because you're always going to fight for your tribe and your flag because that brings you a sense of security. And then that brain survived. And the other ones that weren't, for example, Neanderthals that weren't as social as Homo sapiens, social being a different term for less cunning, less political, those types of things, which are the things today that make society thrive, but also cause a lot of havoc and all those things. We probably killed the Neanderthal because we were more ambitious and that was better for our survival, potentially. Yeah. And they were less social. They didn't have, maybe as many religions and social glue like gossip and those things, and we did. And that caused us to, pack together in tribes and communities much more, and we identified with those tribes and communities, which was good for survival, and it still is. That same mechanism probably is still at play, even though we don't need it for survival in let's say the West, because we're now secure and comfortable, more or less. But the underlying primal instincts are likely still there, and might be, is the hypothesis, rooted in fear, like from beginning to end? Question mark.
So you're saying religion helps bind us to other people, and therefore we want to have that hierarchy, maybe. But then also it's interesting that religions, if you look at their core teachings, are all telling you to not be ambitious, although there might be you might question that, but it's
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah, it's a very interesting point, and even the notion of you shouldn't be greedy, you shouldn't be ambitious. Like if we define ambition as any goal or desire, then even the narrative of you shouldn't be greedy is another desire, another ambition, another goal. And I think it's a very good social glue for sure, religion. And I think Carl Sagan, the late astronomer, and I think physicist. I'm not sure if he was a physicist, but he also said like
Yeah,
it's a very good
astrophysicist.
social lubricant, right? And it covers, I think he said like it covers over differences for people who otherwise wouldn't get along because they have this one thing that they want to all identify with, and all of a sudden that creates some sort of camaraderie, right? I think the one thing that all these, let's say, ideologies and dogmas have in common, all of them, like Christianity, Islam, Taoism, Buddhism, they all are founded on the idea that we as an individual are incomplete, and we have to work on something to complete ourselves, to unify ourselves with God, with nature, with self, whatever it is. All of them have this same mechanism. And I think if you then look at modern temples, let's say corporate world and all those things, marketing companies, political company, institutions, they all use the exact same mechanism, and it is the idea that we are incomplete and need to be fixed and need to become something else, which is again fueling this whole idea of being ambitious, which is an interesting observation if you think about it. It isn't love or salvation that combines or that unifies religions. It's the idea that we are incomplete.
So would you say like a desire for, say, emptiness, say the Buddhists might have, or like Christians, you could say if you're thinking in terms of sin, then that's perhaps not very helpful. I shouldn't do that. I shouldn't be like this. But if you realize actually that behavior in the past, that ambition has caused me suffering, then that's also a religious argument as well that comes across quite a lot. So is that still unhelpful from religion, or is that still not quite getting it? Or is that a positive side of religion?
Again, I guess it depends on the time scale that you look on. Like, sure, in the short term, there's 99,000 ambitions that have a productive and positive impact. I think if you zoom out and you look at the grand scale of things, like over the past 200,000 years, you could say for sure, ambition brought us here, and it was productive and it was positive, and we haven't been as safe as, as we've ever been. So that's all good. But we might be at a point now, if you look at the world, we might be at a point that we have to ask the question, like, has ambition overstayed its welcome? Like, are we now stuck with a brain that is relentless in a sense that it creates suffering through ambition? And it always will. And are we now stuck with it? And that's going to be it. And is it now going to be more destructive than anything else because we've outgrown this primitive brain? That might be the case. And then we'll destroy ourselves. And that's maybe the more pessimistic view. Or is there an alternative scenario in which we can transcend this, let's say, quote unquote, limited brain that can never break from this mechanism of ambition?
I think there has to be a balance somewhere struck in between ambition and, as you said, destructive behaviors that lead to burnout for a lot of people. I think you have statistic after statistic these days showing how young adults and a huge segment of the population is now feeling burned out in their lives, which is causing spiraling mental health issues, and huge unemployment as well between working age men and a myriad other issues. So I do think that there has to be some kind of compromise maybe between, push for hustling and ambition and growth and constant, success. And, people finding what they actually love and what they want to do, happiness in their lives in some way or another.
But to play devil's advocate, isn't that also an ambition, or to do what you love, or to do what you feel like you're meant to be on this earth to do? Is that also an ambition? That's an interesting question to ask. Is it all ambition?
And in the question lies the answer. If you have to ask the question, usually you have the answer, I'd say.
Yeah. I mean, in some way, it's all ambition. In some way, yes.
So even though it's a very noble one, right? And, who doesn't want what you describe? I think everyone would want it in one way or another. But indeed, then the point that John brings up is that it's again this vicious circle. If we use a hypothesis, or if we follow the hypothesis that, okay, and you don't have to, right? Feel free to disagree if you want to ask a different question. But if ambition is causing the havoc that we see in the world, and then any other type of best solution that we can find, be more in touch with arts and the things we want to do and those types of things, if that also causes, again, anxiety in a different way, or because it creates, again, division, you could say that any solution is divisive in that sense, then nothing that we come up with intellectually as a solution is going to be the solution, because it will always create space between the solution and that which we don't want. Is there then an alternative way of living, of being, and can our brain do that, or maybe not? Like, that's maybe a fair question to ask. I don't know, we shouldn't maybe try and find the answer, but it's probably the next fair question to ask. Like, can we operate in a state as humans with this brain where we are not ambitious and still have productive output? Because like a good argument could be, but if we're not ambitious, we're not going to find, discover anything, and we're not going to get to Mars and all that. So if we're not being ambitious, do we have a reason to get out of bed? Is that like the trade-off, or is there a state in which we can be very productive and invent all these cool things as a species, as an organism, without having an I that is ambitious and that needs to become and needs to improve? Like, is that the only mechanism in play to invent things? Or could there be a different type of being and relationship with each other in the world that we can envision that is not that? It's maybe an interesting thought exercise.
Because arguably you go.
Go on, John.
I was just saying, arguably we're the most productive when we're in a flow state, when there isn't so much of an I, or you might argue otherwise. But it's interesting that we think of ambition and productivity as together. But to build on your point, perhaps there is more productivity to be found and perhaps channeled in a more positive way when it's not like an I behind it, which is planning and pushing.
Yeah, it's an interesting point.
I think at the same time, it's not one size fits all. I think different people respond to different levels of, engagement. I mean, someone can be really driven to kind of work hard, push harder, achieve to the highest extent of their abilities. And I can imagine a scenario where someone is just as happy with, yes, still working hard, but not necessarily wanting to go above and beyond in some way, and still, be fulfilled without necessarily, working hard 24/7.
Right. No, I think that's a very fair point, and it reminds me of, or maybe to build on that, if let's take the person that works very, very hard and that is working on her highest potential and the highest output possible. Like, I haven't come across that person, but let's imagine a person and she is able to work extremely hard and live up to her full potential in the sense that we all have, in the sense of ambition and professional progress and all those things. You could argue that if she uses the mechanism of ambition, and if we follow the hypothesis that ambition is driven by fear, which means that we live in a state of that she has a lot of stress, and we can call it positive stress, right? And productive stress, which some people tend to believe as well, that it's something, you have good stress as well. And so she operates in a complete state of quote unquote good stress. For the brain, if it's good stress or bad stress, it creates the same hormones and chemicals, whether it's good stress or bad stress. And those chemicals, if you're exposed to them in a chronic way, eat away at the brain, literally. So if you're under chronic stress, cortisol and all those other substances and chemicals will actually eat away at the brain, and the brain will become smaller and smaller, and the areas in your brain, let's say the emotion process centers and those types of things, get smaller. The pieces of the brain that cater to logical thinking become smaller. Like literally, this has been proven by scientific research. You could argue then that that person who operates at the highest state of being ambitious and productive output is working in such a limited capacity because the brain gets smaller and smaller that it's counterproductive. And then I think maybe a little bit to the point that John was making, if you're in a state where there is no I that is ambitious, would we potentially free up a lot of energy? And would we free up the operation of the brain in such a positive and productive way that it operates at even a higher scale of productivity and invention and creativity, much more than the person that operates at a very high, ambitious, and productive level, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, but with flow states, one of the criteria often that they put is you have to have a goal, whether that's short term, long term, but probably a short term goal, which would imply perhaps some sort of ambition. I don't know what your thoughts are in relation to that. Because like we got unlimited things that we could do. What's to make us sit down and do one task over another? Presumably, we have to weigh that qualitatively or quantitatively, and that implies some sort of goal or ambition.
Yeah. Well, imagine an organism, a human being that has no sense of self, and that still is presented with, here is a goal, here is like scientific research that we need to do to cure cancer. Here are all the tools. Here's all the research. They have been educated, but they have no sense of self. They could look at it, at the data, at the challenge, and at the world and say, this is still the most productive thing to do, and I will wake up tomorrow with all this energy freed up by not thinking about myself and being ambitious. And arguably, they would have a faster or more valuable output and potentially more creative output than someone who has a sense of I, that is highly ambitious and that's working on the same challenge.
So you're saying there's this sense of challenge and we want to also play with it, or to have something to do. Like you say, you got no other ambition, so you got a challenge in front of you. It's the best challenge you see in sight. Then let's just go and do that challenge. And
yeah. I honestly believe, like, to the question, would we get out of bed if we don't have ambition? Like, you don't need a sense of self to be productive necessarily. Like, imagine a world where no one has a sense of self and there's like only one hive mind kind of mechanism, and there's all the challenge and all the education and all the knowledge and ability to think rationally and to reason and all those things. We would probably have much higher productive outputs than the ones that we've had until today, because arguably we're being limited by these also short-term effects and short-term thinking that the I and the ego brings to the scene. Potentially. Maybe we would have already cured cancer, or we would have already stopped world hunger if there was no sense of self and no ambition tied to a sense of self. Maybe if it was one big hive mind, we would have used all the resources that we had not to think about what is he going to think about me, or when do I get the big house, and use all those brain resources to actually work on the problem, not think about politics, not think about religion, all those things that actually stifle and have historically degressed scientific research and inventions and new insights.
Yeah, I think when you really look into a lot of jobs, they're really just the equivalent of getting some people to dig holes and other people to fill the holes in.
Yeah.
It feels productive, but it's not actually doing anything. It's just sort of occupying our energy, going in a circle. We feel like we might be getting somewhere. And
exactly.
Things sometimes change, but it's not actually it doesn't get us anywhere.
That is true. That is true. I was reading a book by the American historian William Durant. I think it was his last book, called Fallen Leaves. So him and his wife, I think his name was Ariel Durant and William Durant, they wrote a lot of books on history and philosophy. And one of his main observations was that wisdom doesn't get passed on through centuries, rather through years. Meaning that the wisdom that we find and the discoveries and all those things have a very short lifespan, and they don't get passed on through generations as we think they do. We think once we found a wisdom or an insight, it's universal and it's timeless. It isn't. Like, it gets cancelled, it gets forgotten, all those things. And, historically, we've burned so many books, we've canceled so many cultures. It was done to the Egyptians and way before. Like, it's not something new. Like, cancel culture has been around for thousands and thousands of years. We've been doing it. We've become very good at it. So arguably, all these things that we've used to cancel and to burn knowledge and to destroy wisdom were all fueled, without exception, by this sense of I at a very small individual scale or very large scale, like religion or tribalism, those types of things. So arguably, we could have had many, many, many more inventions and discoveries than the ones we have today if it was not for this sense of self that ironically has driven the inventions and discoveries that we do have today.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, children aren't religious in that sense, at least. They might be religious in some spiritual sense, but they're not religious in the sense of getting insulted if your football team or your religion wins or has some point which goes against yours.
Yeah. Could you repeat that last point?
How far do you want me to go back? What did you miss?
The last point that you're saying, just the last part.
Well, I was just saying that, perhaps feeds into our discussion of children and ambition. Is that the reason, or is that related? Like, I don't know. I would feel like football teams, children don't really care what football teams win up to a certain age. And that's probably to do with some sense of ego, of you've attached your sense of I to something else doing well.
Yeah. They haven't self-identified yet with a tribe or anything like that. Not just yet. Not that the scale that we do.
Going back to the point on there, you're saying the ambitious person might want to solve cancer because of a challenge. Do you think it comes down to ultimately play, and children start identifying with other external factors or the eye of the football team doing well because they slowly lose that sense of play, either because that's natural or because it's instilled by parents that you shouldn't be playing in certain ways? And I don't know. What do you reckon?
I don't know if you have an idea, Dinos. I have one idea on this.
You go on first. I'm curious to hear more about your ideas.
I'm thinking about research that has been done on kids with snakes. So, in a sense that what they've done is they've put snakes with small babies, essentially babies that can just
after a certain age they're afraid of it, and before a certain age they show no fear.
Exactly. And like the actual pivotal point in when they show fear is when they look at the face of the parents. Because, they're being put next to the snake, they touch it, they want to grab it, and then they look at the parents, and the parents' face is like, completely frightened, and then they pick up on that, and then they know because of the mirror neurons in their head, I shouldn't be doing this. Like monkey see, monkey do. So in a sense, we've been hardwired to look for external validation because, again, it's a good survival mechanism. If, the monkey sees, the monkey does. But then they get at a point where all of us, we keep seeking external validation. And it's very hard to just, be with ourselves, and ourselves meaning not with our self, like just being in a state of observation and awareness rather than trying to tie it to past experiences and thoughts and dogma and whatever we've been brought up with in education. And again, the question that I then have is like, can we break free from it, or are we actually biologically hardwired to think in a way that always makes us look for external validation, which makes us much more susceptible to John's point, that we'll start attributing our identity and ourself with, that football club and not another one. And that we'll feel insulted if someone insults our team or our tribe or our religion, whatever it is, because it goes against, or it feeds into this mechanism of survival if we try to protect something that in turn can protect us or at least give us a sense of security.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've just got up here Robert Cialdini's book on influence, which I read quite a long time ago now, but he had some sort of list of cognitive biases that people fall prey to. This is in the marketing sense, but I think it's generally the case that people are falling prey to these biases all the time. So there's Veblen goods that are more expensive, the better quality is rarer. It's contrast bias, so contrasting with other people. Gifts, and if you give something to someone, it creates a debt. If people feel like you owe that person, then you lost me
a little bit.
You're back.
Yeah, so commitment bias. Do you feel like you set off in one direction, you should carry off and keep going in that direction, and that's probably because you've told other people you're doing that, and therefore you feel like you should keep going.
Yeah.
And social bias, yeah, we react to social proof, as we were saying, or like how other people react. We sort of look at what are they doing, and therefore we base our reaction on that. So like the waiting room experiments that you've probably heard of, where if people stand up in a waiting room, if they're actors and there's one person who's not an actor, every time there's a beep or something goes off, then those people will stand up, and eventually the actor will start standing up because they'll just be like, oh, I better join them just in case. And then there's the authority bias as well. So we think we got some authority figure that perhaps we want something from or we fear, and therefore we start basing our actions off that. And scarcity bias as well comes down to the hierarchy as well, because we want something so we can get further up the hierarchy.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good point. I haven't read the book, but yeah, there's all these mechanisms in play just to, I think, perpetuate the same type of, approval behavior, approval-seeking behavior, and yeah, like, do you guys think it's hardwired, or do you think it's like educated and conditioned into us by society?
I
Or
wonder
do you
if
think
it's
society
like
is a reflection of the hardwiring and the genes? Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if it's like, maybe you could say it's like genes. You can have certain genes, but also the environmental factors trigger them or they don't trigger them. And
Right.
therefore, so we could be susceptible to it, but it's
Right.
how our other people treat us, and maybe the expressions on other people's faces which activate those genes.
Right. And do you think?
I think it's a little bit, as Aydin mentioned, with the experiment with the babies and the snakes, seeing our parents' reactions. I think there's a degree of imprinting that happens from our parents into us, along with evolutionary biological mechanisms that are also at play.
Right. And do you imagine? Okay, let's do a thought experiment. And I think maybe Aldous Huxley wrote a book on this with Island, although I'm not entirely sure it's the same idea. But imagine you would put newborns on an island. Do you think you could educate them and condition them in such a way that they are completely free from a sense of self and a sense of ambition? Or do you think that's always going to be there, no matter what?
I think if you followed your train of thought, that fear triggers a lot of our ambition. The babies in the island would still be fearful of survival. Therefore, you'd still have ambitious babies trying to survive all the harshest conditions of the island in a way.
Yeah. Putting down
if we follow that trail of thought.
The war signs and stuff. But and do you think, like, a follow-up question? Do you think so? If we assume that the sense of fear and the survival and that's always going to be there, do you think you could educate babies in a way that they wouldn't have a sense of self? Which is a different way of asking what causes the sense of self.
I think that's a tricky question.
Yeah.
But I will say that I think our sense of self arises from the complexity of the human brain and how we develop rational thought. Therefore, out of the rational thought comes our own individual sense of self, which includes, all the individual person's drives and ambitions that come with it.
Yeah. What do you think, John?
Yeah, I don't know whether you could completely condition out conditioning or not even, create conditioning. But you could probably do significantly better by not doing certain things. For instance, just like not comparing, not setting up arbitrary factors which compare one person with another, such as grading or medals or whatever. And perhaps even like a competitive. Are you still got me? Am I still here?
Yeah.
Have I fallen out? Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's not to say like sport is a bad thing. I enjoy sport, but actually I think it can end up creating, it's another one of those things that can create that sort of competition for basically an idea of, so you can say that you were first. And there's plenty of sports which are not related to that idea of being the first. So for instance, surfing. So yeah, I think all those little things, and like kids under age of 5 don't tend to do competitive sports.
Yeah. No, I see that as well. It's a good question. I think in a way, this is my wife plugging in my phone because the battery is almost dead.
Wife to the rescue.
Yeah. No, I think the question that, like in this sense, the question that I've tried to ponder is, and I think I know, John, you've been reading some Jiddu Krishnamurti, which is like an Indian philosopher that does a lot of work on trying to uncover, what is the self and what is awareness and those types of things. And I think he made the observation, or he asked the question at one point, like, what creates the sense of self, or what creates the thinker, right? Like, is it the thinker that creates the thoughts, or is it the thoughts that create the thinker? And by asking the question, more or less intuitively, we kind of feel what the answer might be. And it might be that it's the thoughts that create the thinker, in a sense that if who we are as a person is a set of ideas and experiences and memories, then who we are is a set of thoughts. And potentially, and this is again a hypothesis, the brain is a thinking machine, and the brain creates a thinker so to perpetuate the thoughts we have about ourselves, right? Meaning that if the brain is able to create a thinker, an entity that has thoughts about itself, who we think we are and who we think the world has to see us as, and who we think we have to reform and improve, then again, this feeds into this idea that we were discussing, that there's some sort of survival mechanism that needs to be kept going and needs to be fueled. And if the brain is indeed just a thinking machine that has created this virtual reality of a thinker, that's a very good vessel, a very good medium to perpetuate thoughts and fears about ourselves, as to uphold and keep the brain intact and keep the brain going.
Therefore, do you think, is there any way for us to rewire our brain to change those thoughts and those thought patterns in any way?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a good question. Like there's two ways to approach your question, right? Is it merely us changing our mind, in a sense? Like, can we change our thoughts and reprogram our thoughts in such a way that we see the world differently, intellectually then? Or is it in such a way that because the brain is a thought machine first, that has every intention to keep us in the dark and to create this illusion that there is a self that needs reforming and protecting? If the latter is the case, then there's probably no way out of it. And then there's no way of outthinking it, because it would just feed again into the same system. If it's just a matter of changing our thoughts and changing our mind, then I would say we come to the next question, like, can we do it as long as there's a sense of self, maybe? Because thinking itself isn't necessarily the problem. Like, thinking and questioning things and having memories is a good way of inventing new things and projecting stuff into the future and all that stuff. So the thinking itself isn't the problem that causes a lot of frustration and suffering. It's more the sense of self and this identity, this thinker that is there, that we try to protect and reform, that causes all the suffering that we see. So the question then maybe becomes, like, can we remove the thinker from the equation? And if not by outthinking it, if not by removing it by thought, then potentially how could we do it? Or how could it be done? Because if we say how could we do it, again, we're in the same mechanism. Like, how can a brain, or a different operating system on the brain, how can it present itself without the ambition to change it or to have it present something else?
I guess you could make a point where you just need to somehow see it. You could sort of realize, just see it. But yeah, it's easier said than done.
Well, to flip that around, rather than saying how do we see it, why are we not seeing it in the first place? Because by asking how do we see it, again, you're creating this answer-seeking behavior. I'm not having a go at you, like, I do it as well, everyone does it. But by asking how do we see it, you're creating, again, a goal to get to, rather than if you rephrase the question and say, why do we not see it in the first place? You're just inquiring, you're just questioning things, and you're not looking for the answer. You're just looking for the next question. So why do we not see it in the first place? And rather than finding the answer to that question, what could be the next question?
I don't know. This sort of stuff sort of leads me to sort of think, just I don't have any questions to ask. I don't know. Like, it leads me to that dead end, which may be a positive space. I don't know.
In my mind, I think that the sense of self creates a sense of wanting. Like, it creates automatically, your sense of self leads you to have a set of wants. Therefore, these wants create your ambition, and therefore they are your drive to get out of the bed every morning. Without the sense of self, you wouldn't really have. I don't see how can someone have any wants if they don't have a sense of self. And therefore they'd just be a brainless zombie in my mind, at least. I
Right.
don't know.
Well, it's a fair question. Like maybe compare it to other animals that don't necessarily have a sense of self. How do they
They
operate?
they just operate on instinct for survival, I would think,
Right.
which isn't necessarily a sense of wanting something, but more of a just an innate drive to
Mm,
get food, get water, get shelter. While we kind of think, oh, I want something nice. I don't just want something to survive as such. You know, whatever that nice is subjective to each individual person, but
right.
it's not just covering. Obviously, people that are in survival mode, there are people in this world who are only thinking about survival. They don't think about, achieving or,
Yeah.
ambition. They just
Sure.
think about
Sure.
food, water, shelter. And I
Absolutely.
think these people don't operate with ambition in mind. Well, they might do. Well, obviously they would do because they would want to
Mm,
get something better, but their prime goal is to get
yeah.
the basic things. Unless you have the basic things, obviously, you cannot go over that to, you know, building something.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting point because probably we're very fortunate in the sense that we were born into a world that is safe and that gives us the luxury to think about these things. You have a lot of people who aren't as fortunate and they have to think about survival and getting food, you know, the next day, and they may not be certain that they have the next day. But I would think that all of them, wherever people are on the spectrum, they are ambitious and they have goals and they want to achieve things. Like otherwise, we wouldn't be as a species, we wouldn't be where we are today because certain clusters of people had the context and the luxury to invent stuff and get ahead and create a better world for themselves. It makes me think of, let's say, different species as well. Like maybe the question could be, well, maybe one step back. If you look at, for example, very instinctive, as you put, so we have very instinctive animals that don't have a sense of self, let's say lizards or birds, whatever. And then you have us on the other side of the spectrum. In between, you have other animals, for example, let's say primates, who are quite clever, but they do have a sense of self. We know that primates, recognize themselves in the mirror. We know that they wage wars. There's tribes of primates that, will kill the other because of territory and because of very rudimentary social structures and politics and those types of things. So there are, different varieties of what it is that we do. Is there a species that has a sense of self that does not do these things? Is maybe an interesting question that I would ask. Like maybe there's like I don't know the answer by the way, but maybe there's like an octopus or I don't know something that has intelligence and that has a sense of self and that does have productive output and maybe social structures, but no sense of individualism, let's say, or that doesn't self-identify with the bag of meat and bones or whatever type of organism it is. I don't know if there is any of those. If there's an animal like that we know of.
What about ants? They don't really have a sense of self, I guess, so much. But
Interesting one, yeah. Ants or
they have more
bees
of a
that
hive
are
mind.
right. Yeah, yeah, that's an interesting one. Hmm.
So could we work together as ants? Would that be a productive
Hmm.
strategy, or is that
Yeah.
naive to think that's possible?
Hmm. That's a good one. Well, look, I think we all want to imagine, at least I do, I want to imagine a world where we are in complete harmony and the African Ubuntu, because we are. There's this story of an African tribe where a journalist comes into the tribe, right? And he says, I've left some candy up by that tree. Whoever gets it first gets the candy. And what the kids do, they grab each other's hands and they run together towards the tree so they all have the candy, which is the concept of Ubuntu, right? I am because we are, which is nice. And to an extent, you can probably educate this into tribes and societies, I guess. Well, I guess like it's been done.
I think that used to happen into smaller community level in the past, where people lived in smaller communities, where
Mm,
people really looked out for each other. They shared food,
right.
resources more often, just because they had these closer bonds with each other and their neighbors. rather than what we are today now that we triple lock our doors because we don't know anyone.
Yeah, it's not necessarily that it's not necessarily that Ubuntu is a necessary philosophy that's driven into kids. It might be just the philosophy that they naturally have that is talked about. But I open to arguments both ways on that. But if it is how I put it, then I think the chasing towards a suite or whatever and going together, that would naturally happen as long as there's not my camera went anyway. I think as long we're chasing towards some food together and being communal about it would naturally happen unless there's the fear behind it that we've not got enough food and therefore we need to have more and therefore it's me against you. And also if it's a small community then you don't have a hierarchy, so there's a limit to how much you can get above other people, and so there's basically not that much point trying to get sort of too far above your position.
Interesting point, because I've even seen smaller communities, let's say 10-ish people, where there is clear hierarchy. And obviously granted, these people were put together, let's say at a later age, at a later stage, they chose to form a community and live very small. But even there, you see the same struggles, the same politics, the same hierarchy as we would have in a very large society or community. But it's maybe different from people who actually grow up with this idea. Like the risk there, though, let's say the African tribe, the kids that grow up with this idea of Ubuntu, the risk you could see is though that they would self-identify with this notion of Ubuntu and of the tribe, and arguably the same kind of underlying frustration and same underlying mechanism that operates on fear still operates. Like even though their sense of self is much more linked to, more of a hive mind kind of operating system, they're not necessarily less fearful or, whether it's subconscious or conscious, they might still operate in the exact same way. What do you think?
I do wonder if, the sense of fear comes from a sense of being pushed out of the community, because when we lived in smaller communities, the majority wouldn't want to have a dead weight doing nothing, as part of their community and being, dragging the whole community down. So therefore there would be this kind of drive for everyone in the community to be just as productive as everyone else, in the fear of being left behind, for example, which would mean, most likely death if you were left.
Yeah.
If you're kicked out of a community that you lived in. So I wonder if that is also part of, our interaction with other people that drives us, to be part of that, of the communities we live in. We want to be ambitious and work hard and, make sure we are just as good as everyone else in the community. But I do wonder, what is your views now that we live in a much more virtual world in social media, where we're not as much as connected with our neighbors, but much more interconnected through the internet. How do you think that will change ambition or impact it in any way?
Yeah. Good question. I think stuff like social media amplifies and perpetuates and fuels the underlying mechanism that does create anxiety and stress. Right? I think that's obvious, right? And I think we see it in research that's being done now, and why certain social media platforms are being, because we invoke all these rules now, and we try and guide them towards saying, well, 16-year-olds shouldn't see X, Y, and Z, and we should limit screen time and all those things. It's because we're starting to see what we already knew. We let it happen because of probably capitalism, and it made a lot of money in ads and stuff. But we're at a point where we see it's probably not a good idea if 2-3 generations in one go up being, 10 times more anxious than the ones before. And have no self-esteem and all those types of things. So I think the mechanisms that product owners and marketing people and those companies use amplify what is already there, and it's like this mechanism that is rooted in fear, I think, and they just push on it, and they push on it just to make more money, and it does in the short term, obviously. It pushes that dopamine button and will keep pushing it. Like research done in 50 or 60 with rats. So what they did was they hooked up these rats to a button. So they put electrodes in the brain. They gave them a button. If they pushed the button, they would self-stimulate the pleasure center of the brain. Obviously, these rats would push the button until they would literally die, because they would stop eating, they would stop drinking, they would just keep pushing that button, as would anyone else probably if you were given such a button. And scrolling social media and hitting the like button and seeing that you've received likes is the exact same thing. Like, we've given people the button to stimulate that pleasure center of the brain. And we're doing so by using all of the mechanisms that we can exploit to put fear into people, to put doubt into people, and that we're not good enough, that we are incomplete, and that only by having certain status, having certain relationships and all those things, enough followers, whatever it is, only then will we feel complete. And we've tested it now for 10 years. People have gained millions and millions of followers and likes, and no one feels complete. So it didn't work, right? And we knew it wouldn't work, but still we did it.
Yeah. I think fear of rejection, if you really hair back to us, we've got all these varied fears that separate us, but actually if we ask why, it's often comes back to some sort of fear of rejection, which I guess is, in a way, is a primal sort of fear.
Of course, yeah.
Again, it goes back to what I was saying. You don't want to be rejected by the community because it meant certain death at some point further back enough.
Yes. And we evolved in such a quick way that the primal survival mechanism is still there. We're at a point where people can just exploit it at scale. We have no defenses against it.
So do you think that people who use social media less will be more ambitious? Well, not more ambitious, but ambitious in a different way, in a less anxious way, let's say.
So is the question, do people who use social media less, are they more ambitious?
Yeah, if people limit their social media use and their exposure to this, overstimulation, can organize themselves and their ambition to a better degree, let's say.
Like, the cheap answer would be, I think it's the same but different. Like, I still, and I'm biased obviously, but I still think the mechanism is the same thing. Like, obviously, I think the people that have tendency to self-gratify through social media, through porn, whatever it is, might be prone to having no productive output in the short term, especially people who are really addicted to it, or who suffer from it in a social scale and all those things. Obviously, those will suffer from it and will have not much to show for. And we're only now starting to see what it will do in the long term with people's development of the brain and stuff. But I do think the mechanism underlying is the same as people who are, let's say, not on social media and who are quote unquote productive in a quote unquote positive, ambitious way. The hypothesis would be that all the havoc we see in the world is caused by that mechanism. And we may or may not have a way out of it. Like, that's still the question. And hopefully that's something I'll be able to uncover as I continue writing the book. Like, the jury is still out on that one. But we still will have this, we still have a very large degree of suffering and pain and all those things caused by even the most positive and productive ambition, because it's the same mechanism that operates on this foundation of fear. Potentially. In the book, I'm not trying to make the point that is the case. I'm still trying to ask all the right questions to see if that's a logical insight or observation. I might come to the conclusion that that's not the case. I'm still open to that, by the way. But so far, I don't see anything to the contrary.
Asking the question is the first step, I think, to the right direction. But asking the right question is also just as important. Yeah.
Do you think that our environment is important to asking the question, as the ancient Greeks would say, that it's as important as where you do a philosophy as what philosophy you're doing? And if we're not satisfying those basic human needs of maybe being in nature enough and having healthy food, drinking enough water, having some social relationships, can we ask that question in isolation and hope that change will change everything else? Or is that question coming out of we feel there's something missing and it's actually the basics are missing. So we think we need to overachieve to get something beyond that to solve what was actually quite a basic thing, which has been eroded.
It's a very good question. There's multiple questions in there.
Sorry, I chucked it all out here.
No, that's fair. I think the first one, the context that we operate in and the environment. Intuitively, I would say, yes, it's important. Healthy mind, healthy body, those types of things. But there's also like a number of philosophers and poets and whatnot who grew up in very poor circumstances, who didn't have good nutrition, weren't safe, who were maybe even in jail, captured by the enemy, whatnot, who produced some of the most profound philosophical ideas and stuff. So then I would say no, it's not that important. I would say the context that you're in. I think there's this quote by an American philosopher called Robert Pirsig, who wrote the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And there's a famous quote by him saying, "The Zen you find on top of a mountain is the Zen you bring there," right? So there is no inherent Zen on top of a mountain. It's just you and the thoughts, or the thoughts and the you that are produced by the thoughts. So in that point, no, I don't think the context is that important.
I could get on board with that, because you got say hermits who perhaps just live in a cave all the time. Maybe you could maybe argue they're not happy, right, but they could well be. Yeah. So it's maybe not necessarily having the certain basics, but it's also, I would argue, maybe because of the modern world, we have got that dopamine button in whatever way, and that kind of broken brain ask those questions, or if they get to some sort of insight, aren't they just going to go straight back to the addictive right, behavior?
Yeah, that's a good point. To that point, I do myself, I feel that, if I spend more time in nature, I have better insights, for lack of better words. So I do recognize that there is something to it. And to then the quote from earlier that I mentioned from William Durant, wisdom doesn't get passed on through centuries, rather years. We can have, let's say, the three of us, we would have like the most profound insight between the three of us, maybe not on an intellectual level, like on an actual pure awareness kind of observational level. We have all of the three of us, we have this insight, but we have no way of actually passing it on to the masses because it transcends the intellectual, whatever you want to call it. Then we're in a state where there's no critical mass to actually, create transformation on a societal level. And it might be so that we simply are stuck with a brain that isn't capable of having these insights because we're stuck in, let's say, illusions like space and time and progress and like all these abstractions that may not have a foothold in actual reality, and we may not have a brain that is able to look past it, potentially. If we were to have a brain, let's say, we're optimistic and we assume that we have a brain that is capable of doing that. We've just been educated in a way that it is stuck in these abstractions and illusions and stuff. Then there's still the issue that, how do we create enough critical mass quickly enough to cause this ripple in society, or whatever you want to call it, where all of a sudden we're able to transcend ambition and be more productive without a sense of self and all these things? That is the next question. Like maybe it's a matter of hooking everyone up to a computer and digitizing consciousness, and then all of a sudden we see it all at once. Who knows? And I think we'll get to a point where we're able to digitize, especially with quantum computing and stuff. We'll be able to digitize consciousness. If it is a physiological matter, and if it's only a matter of electrical impulses, and we're able to map that and digitize it, then we will be able to. If it's something external, then probably not. But maybe there's a future where we can all be in one connected hive mind, like the internet, but much more direct. And we're able to.
Though I think that can be a bit of an episode of a Black Mirror for a lot of people. I'd like to say that this is one of the scariest scenarios for a big segment of the population. So I don't know how receptive people would be to their consciousness being digitized and tampered by other people. I think this is
it's already
stuff of nightmares for a lot of people.
Fair, but it's already happening. In a sense, like in a very basic way, right? We have our sense of self digitized with an online profile, a resume on LinkedIn, photos on Instagram. Like it is an extension of the self, literally, and it is digitized, and people are able to influence it, and we are influenced by it. So in a sense, it's already there. And if it's convenient enough, because a phone is very convenient to get dopamine shots, so we all have it in our pocket, it could just as well be glued to our hand. We would have no issues with it. And now with augmented reality glasses and the Neuralink chips that we're building and all that stuff, we'll get to a point where there's like a good reason, and it's a convenient enough reason to actually implant these chips into our brain, to be connected to the internet, to be able to actually ask questions to ChatGPT by just thinking it. People, if that's possible, people will do it. And then it's a very small step towards, and now we're all connected because the internet is already there. And maybe that will be the inflection point where all of a sudden the hive mind becomes self-aware. All of a sudden, we lose this sense of self and individuality because we are literally hooked into each other at that point, at a very direct and basic level. Could be it.
I think the problem is, you say that, yes, that's fair enough. But the problem is, what if there's someone who isn't connected into the hive mind and just controls the hive mind from the outside?
Right.
So I think this is another thing for people to consider, that I think people are afraid of. This. I'm only talking about, but just playing the devil's advocate and
I like
playing out a few dystopian
but again,
scenarios.
Would you not say that's already the case, right? We're all hooked into the internet. We're all like cultivating and reforming this sense of digital self. And there are people outside of that mechanism, like they're also hooked into the same mechanism themselves for their own individual needs and desires, whatever it is. But they also influence, let's say on another layer, they also influence big parts of society and people. So in a way, it's already happening, right? And that's not to say that because it's already happening, it's fine, we should continue to do it. But like, we shouldn't fool ourselves. It's already happening, I think. We're just in version 1.0 of the hive mind, which is there's still some barrier, like there's still the action needed of us putting up online information and other people interacting with it. But if you get to a point where it's all directly linked to each other at the speed of light, then it's the same as the thoughts that form in our brain. Like we feel and we see no distinction of where a thought is being formed in our brain and how it's being influenced by certain parts of the brain that we can't access. Let's call it the subconscious. And we don't know, what is this, where is the sense of self being created? And is it something that is controlling us, or are we controlling it? We don't know. That's how the brain works. Could just well be if you hook everyone up to the hive mind with a direct integration at the speed of light, that we lose the sense of self because we don't know anymore where we are in the network or what we are in the network. It's just like one continuous flow of consciousness and thought, let's say. I don't know.
No, that's an interesting idea, or slightly scary, but also slightly interesting.
Yeah.
But people couldn't live in that state, could they? Or do you reckon they could just live connected?
What do you mean live?
That way? Well, you couldn't have any productivity beyond digital productivity.
Oh, I see what you mean, because there's still like the bag of meat that is hooked up to a system.
Yeah, and you need that bag of meat to go outside and do physical things in some way to actually have some sort of non-digital impact on the world.
Right.
No, but I thought in your scenario, what you're talking, Aydin, was like that we'd all have a chip that would connect us in our brain, and therefore would still be moving around into the physical world, but still mentally connected in one way or another, right?
Right.
Is that what I understand it?
Exactly, but the hypothesis could be that if we're connected in such a way, if we're all instantly connected to each other, could the sense of self dissolve? Because we wouldn't know anymore where we fit in, and would we then operate as agents of that hive mind in a productive way? We'd still have the same intellectual and cognitive capabilities to find the cure for cancer, but we wouldn't know anymore, or feel the sense of self in the same way that we don't know where our sense of self currently in our brain originates from.
In my mind, that would be the case if there is nothing spiritual.
Right, yeah.
On
the foundation that consciousness is a physiological.
Well, yes, because we've talked a lot about spirituality in our podcast as well. And if we say that everything is, hardwired inside the brain and there's no spiritual element to it, there's no, because there is a lot of a lot of where actually ideas come from, the realm of ideas, and a lot of spiritual implications about how ideas are born. I think if there's no place like that, and there's no, real spirituality that's affecting us at any level,
Right.
then yes, maybe you're right. But if there is, then I would be afraid that being connected into like a digital hive mind would block out
Right.
any kind of level of spirituality and any level of creativity that stems from that spiritual realm,
Why
and
do you think
therefore we would have nothing new happening.
why do you think that would be blocked out?
Because we wouldn't be able to, if you're connected into that digital world all the time, into a hive mind, I don't think you'd be able to tap into your own, individual,
It feels to me like
deeper self, if
you
maybe.
lose some sort of authenticity. Like
Yeah,
those ants, they're all working together, but who for? Like, there's no actual individual ant which will benefit. They will benefit from like having better health because the colony survives, but they're not actually going to be fulfilled in any sort of meaningful sense. They're just like a robot system.
I don't feel like, I feel it would just result to us working like robots, and there wouldn't be any room for the Mona Lisa or the Sistine Chapel, anywhere in there.
It's I don't know. Like, it's an interesting hypothesis as well to say that if we don't have a sense of self, we would lose our touch with, let's say, the arts and the creativity. Like, if I'm paraphrasing you correctly, feel free to disagree, but that's what I'm taking away from that. I don't know. Maybe. Although, like, we don't know.
I feel it would result to just the productivity / efficiency machine for the good of the hive mind.
Maybe.
In my mind, at least. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong as well.
No, maybe, but it poses the next question, right? Does our creativity and art and all those things, does it come from a sense of self? Can we still not have the same experiences and relationships and memories without a sense of self that might fuel, let's say, these expressions of art and creativity? Because some people, have very creative expressions through suffering and hurt and a relationship that ended and all those things. So the question is, without a sense of self, can you still have those types of relationships and the same type of hurt that would fuel these creative outbursts or music that you would create, whatever it is? I think it's a fair question. I don't know if we'll have the answer today, but
Sure
it's an interesting question that I hadn't asked.
There's a lot to unpack there for sure.
Right. And in terms of spirituality, if you want to call it that, or where does consciousness come from if it's not a materialistic result? What are your thoughts on that? Like, what do you think? If not that, what could be like a good alternative hypothesis? If it's not, let's say, confined to the body, what are your thoughts on it otherwise?
You could say consciousness precedes the matter rather than matter precedes consciousness, which is a debate which has gone back through the centuries. I'm not sure where I stand, but you could argue that matter is maybe an illusion of space and time. You still, I think I dropped out. But yeah, so consciousness is our word for the thing which is beyond the block universe of space and time that Einstein posited. If you go deep enough or into quantum physics, then, or you penetrate deep enough into things, then you do tend to get to a breakdown of space and time. I don't know if it's called a Planck scale or something, and therefore consciousness is maybe what's there, which we struggle to put a name on.
Right. Yeah, I think was it David Hoff who wrote like a paper on the fact that
Hoffman?
Could be. Sounds like it. It was a person who had this idea quite recently that we are what he called agents of consciousness, where it's not space-time that is fundamental reality, but it is consciousness. And every expression in the natural world, whether it's an Apple Pencil or it's a tree or it's a human, they're all different expressions of nature trying to interact with consciousness. And, we're some sort of receptor, some sort of antenna for consciousness, and we're just, scratching the surface in terms of how we interact with it and how we perceive it. And in a way, it's the universe trying to uncover itself and understand itself, right? I think that was the main idea that he was trying to investigate and explore, which is a cool hypothesis, right? Because we do see, obviously, that And I think it was his point as well, right? Space and time, which is the Einsteinian type of way of looking at the universe, does only seem to work very well at the human scale. And if you look at very grand scale, and we're talking about the dynamics between planets and galaxies even, it doesn't really work. The laws of Einsteinian physics and Newtonian physics, because it only works if we add in this notion of black matter, which is the idea that if we look into space, right, and we see the dynamics between galaxies, it doesn't add up. Like we're missing a lot of matter. And when I say a lot, we're missing 90% of the matter that we need in order for the formulas to work that we currently have around space-time, which is another way of saying it, they don't work.
Yeah.
We haven't figured it out. And to your point, I think, John, as well, on quantum mechanics and quantum physics, the laws that we have, the current laws of physics, of classic physics, also don't work for quantum, in the quantum realm, which is, below atoms. Which is another way of saying we actually have no idea what is going on. We're only starting to scratch the surface. So it could be that we are agents of consciousness and that is base reality, and that whatever we see or perceive as reality is just a projection or like a virtual reality layer of this brain trying to make sense of all these sensory inputs that we have no actually good way of understanding and interpreting. Which I think is super, super interesting stuff to think about. Like, I like the idea that potentially consciousness is base reality instead of space-time. It touches on different types of concepts in physics as well. For example, time, which I think is a super, super, super interesting one. And I've been doing quite a bit of research into time as well for the book, but just because I find it interesting as well. And the most interesting thing that I learned when researching time is that we actually have no idea what it is, even though we pretend that we do, and because Einstein had all these ideas around time being relative, we got stuck on that piece without actually understanding what time is. We still have no idea, right? It's on one hand, we see it as the measurement of clocks, right? One clock measures the other clock, and that notion of clocks measuring clocks is a very good tool for Einstein's theories of relativity, and they do explain why one clock moves faster than the other one, but it doesn't actually say what time is, right? There's a sense of progress and a sense of duration because there's entropy in the world, which is the change that we see, right? Matter breaking down and changing, which is caused by entropy, second law of thermodynamics. But again, it doesn't actually explain what time is. It introduces a notion of or a feeling of duration, but not really of timing. I think that's one of the most interesting things right now that I'm trying to wrap my head around. Unfortunately, we have absolutely no idea what it is, but I think it's crucial to probably understand what consciousness is and what the self is and what ambition is. I don't know if you guys have done any reading on this or thoughts around it.
Yeah, a while ago I read the Carlo Rovelli's Order of Time.
Oh yeah, that's a very
But
good
yeah,
one.
like being a non-physicist, I struggled to wrap my head completely around it. But I kind of did my idea of time did kind of get eroded in some ways, but then it just comes straight back. So it's like it's an impractical way of living, it seems, and I mean, it feels just so intuitive that there is at least some sort of psychological time at least. And it feels like
Right.
not psychological time. It feels like real time. But even if your clocks are not there, you know the start of a sentence was before the end of a sentence,
Right.
and that's intuitively hard to get your head around.
Well, this is, yeah, but now that you mentioned the start of a sentence is before the end of the sentence, saying that though, I don't know if you know the movie The Arrival.
Yeah. Very cool one with the aliens with the different language.
Yes, which talks about aliens that, if anyone hasn't watched the movie who's watching us, there is going to be spoilers. Effectively, the aliens have a language or a way of communication that is so different to ours that it transcends the meaning of time for them, and therefore they perceive time in a non-linear way.
Right.
Because their communication is...
They even influence
Yes.
time by the way that they communicate.
Exactly.
In a very cool way.
So I was just going to say that our language is made because it is very linear, because we perceive time linearly, but they didn't perceive time linearly in this kind of scenario, these aliens,
Yeah. Exactly.
And and during the process of the movie, they teach their language, that scientist who, when she learns their language, she also starts perceiving time differently now because she perceives this different way of communication.
It is interesting how language does shape our psychology in some ways. We think
Yeah.
it may be the other way around, but like I think there's a certain language which doesn't. I'll try and get this right. I think they say rather than saying it is raining or I am ironing, they say ironing or raining.
Right.
And
Yeah.
there's a subtle thing there which
Yeah.
maybe gets us thinking a certain way, which is perhaps fallacious.
Yeah, and then there's certain languages where you don't say I am a certain age, you say I have a certain age, right? Which I find interesting as well. And I think in Russian there's different, like maybe, I don't know, 14 different words for the color blue, different shades of blue, where we have maybe 2 or 3 best. And they've done research as well, and people have different emotional connections and responses to all these different words of blue. So depending on how nuanced the language is, the actual emotional behavior and change that goes on within people is also different. So and maybe that explains why a lot of these Russian authors are so good. And even the translated books to English from Russian books are typically so much more nuanced than if it was written by English natives, because they just have such a delicate language in that way. Doesn't sound like it when you listen to it, though. It doesn't sound like to me at least, a very nuanced and delicate language. But yeah, literature shows differently, which is super interesting. So it could be a language thing, in a sense, how time is influenced in our head. Again, it could be so that the brain has simply evolved to a state that it creates all these illusions to try and make sense of it all, and that we're just too limited to experience it. Let's, for example, take our sense of now, right? Our sense of now, I think this research shows about like 1/10 or 1/20th of a second. But it isn't just a static instant. Like our sense of now is a duration of time, and it is calculated by looking at different sensory inputs that we have that our brain has to combine to, like if we touch something, we look at it touching. So the sight is already one sensory input to the brain. We touch it, and again, it's another sensory input that moves slower towards the brain. And somehow our brain has to make sense of it as one simultaneous experience in this moment of the now, which is another way of saying there is no now, there is no present moment. It's just whatever our mind is able to create in some sort of illusion that is a sense of now. For example, if you extrapolate this example to a giant the size of the galaxy, imagine a human the size of the galaxy. If that giant looks at a planet from its perspective, it has the exact same experience as we do when we look at something. It's instant. They see the planet as if this is the moment of now, but the time it takes for that electrical impulse to go from the eye of the giant all the way through the brain and back to some sort of experience of the now, that takes a much longer time than our physically smaller brain has to do, or the pathways that these electrical currents have to take. So for the giant, its sense of now, which is instant, could be a lifetime for us, literally. It would be our 70 years of lifetime experiences could be the now of the giant. Just to, give a sense of how fluid it all is, its perception of now and living in the present, like it's all an illusion. It's whatever our mind makes us believe is the sense of now from our perspective.
So have you linked how have you linked then the concept of time with ambition in your book? I don't know if you've gone that far because you said you're recently researching it.
Yeah.
But I know that time is always,
Right.
at least in social media and how hustle culture is these days. It's like time is everything. You need to be working 25 days a day, 25 hours a day, and
Yeah. No, it's a good question, and to be honest, I am in the midst of trying to articulate how those two concepts are linked, but I think it is the key. I think it's crucial to somewhat understand time, or at least the illusion of it, in order to make sense of what is this sense of improvement which comes with the self. Because the feeling that we have is that we can, through time, psychological time, whatever you want to call it, that there's this sense of going forward, of progress, and that if we just struggle long enough, then we'll come out in the end having some sort of insight that will finally make us happy or whatever it is. But I think the more and more I read, and I think the Carlo Rovelli book that John mentioned is a very good one in that sense, is that it dissolves the distinction between past, present, and future, which automatically dissolves the sense of, or the desire for progress in a sense. Once you start to not intellectually understand, but start to see or become aware of the fact that, past, present, and future might be all in the same moment, and that, both psychological time and physical time might be an illusion, it completely, changes the way that you can look at things and you can look at ambition. But I honestly don't know what it means for ambition at this point. Hopefully in a few weeks or a few months, I'll have a better answer. But the fact that we as a species haven't actually been able to, in any meaningful way, articulate what time is, because I think honestly we've only now been starting to question time, let's say in the last 20, 30 years. We might have, like maybe 100,000 years ago, and we may have had the insight then, but as we've learned, wisdom doesn't survive that long.
So is there 10,000 years ago though? In like that's sort of thing I can't get with the time
Right.
thing. Is there 10,000 years ago? Like, is that even a thing? Can we even draw analogies like that?
No, exactly. That is the question, and maybe
because it seems obvious there is like, and obviously that to get to our point here, there must have been some history, some evolution or whatever. And I think that's what Don Hoffman has come up against. His problem is he comes at it from an evolutionary biologist sense of view. So he's worked out that consciousness is there, and he uses evolutionary biology to get to it. But if there's no evolution in the first place, that sort of undermines his argument to get to it.
Yeah, assuming that evolution takes time, right? Takes time in the sense that we are used to it. But we might get to a state where we become so, let's say, enlightened or whatever you want to call it, that we do see that all of it, from the beginning of the universe until now, that all of it happens in the same instant. Right? Because if you take the example of the giant, right, from the perspective of the giant, it's now is 70 years for us. Let's say his blink of an eye is our lifetime. Could be that there's a higher dimension or state of the physical world, or like maybe it's not higher, maybe it's lower, maybe it's in the quantum realm where time stops and all of it happens in the exact same moment, and we have absolutely no sense of time anymore. All of the past, present, and future happens at the exact same moment, and we lose the sense of progress, we lose the sense of evolution. It's all just instant, and maybe we can't even grasp that idea because we're stuck in this illusion of time, and we don't have a brain to look past it.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned in your answer we might at some stage become enlightened, and presumably like become implies some sort of time, but maybe it doesn't.
Absolutely.
Maybe that's the interesting thing. You either get it now or you
Right.
don't get it.
Maybe so. How evolution works is a lot of people think that for how natural selection and evolution works. Some people think that a certain environment presents itself with volcanoes and whatnot, and then the body evolves in a way that is suitable for that environment. That's not how natural selection and evolution works, right? It's the other way around. It's that random mutations happen. So currently, like, even though we think we're the same three people with the same types of brains, there's still different mutations in our body and in our brain, and this happens at scale with anyone. And the brain the body keeps experimenting with new mutations. The ones that tend to survive are the ones that are suitable for the context and the environment that they're already in, and those are the ones that get naturally selected to survive and procreate. And so maybe potentially there have already been brains through random mutation that are capable of looking past time and looking past ambition and the sense of self, but they haven't survived for long enough time because society, quote unquote, doesn't allow them to live for a long enough time, because we frown upon individuals, let's say, that aren't ambitious, or that fall outside of the psychological standard that we think is needed to be normal or healthy. Maybe there's been people that, weren't crazy, that weren't, supposed to be categorized as unhealthy or unfit, that did have a brain that was more evolved or just differently evolved and differently mutated. that was capable of doing the things that we're discussing here. And if not, maybe there will be a point where that type of brain, whether it's in humans or a different kind of animal, is present and is able to actually transcend it. We don't know, but it is very possible that we just are stuck with a brain that perpetuates the illusion of time and the self and progress and ambition, and we'll never get past it unless maybe we find a digital solution some way, or there will be a different brain, or option 3, it will never happen. And this is just it. We don't know.
Very interesting questions and ideas. I think it'll be worth you coming back for another episode again when
with all the answers.
No, not obviously. It was going to be hard to have all the answers, but I mean, further down in your book development, for us to revisit how you've kind of fleshed out these ideas and, you know, the connection of time, evolution, ambition, the sense of self, how you've connected all these different concepts, and maybe give us an overview of how you think all these little pieces of the puzzle fit together, and maybe a key takeaway point that you believe, if you make at the end. I know, you know, as you said, maybe asking the questions is good enough.
Right.
But I think it's very interesting stuff, and I think there's a lot to be gained by thinking about this from a lot of different perspectives.
I appreciate that. Yeah, and I would love to. And like I said at the beginning as well, it's for me a very therapeutical exercise to do, and I'm really enjoying it. And so yeah, if I get to much more interesting questions than the ones we've discussed today, I would love to do so. And I'm optimistic that I will. I don't want to say confident, but I'm optimistic that I will, because I'm right in the moment where, like, every day now I'm working on the book, and I'm like able to connect all the fragments and all the pieces that have been lingering for the past 4 years, and it does combine, you know, biology, physics, and all those things, and philosophy. But yeah, like, gladly, if you would have me, I would love to discuss this, because it's been very interesting for me as well, hearing you guys think about this.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, well, thanks for coming on. Hopefully the internet will be better next time.
Thanks for.
Yeah. And again, I think it was a very great episode again today, because I think even though we usually are much more, you know, spread out, I think we were able to hold this conversation quite contained and still connect everything back to the ambition in the different stages of of the conversation. So I did think it was great, and thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me, and you guys did a good job keeping things together and not letting me derail too much. Thank you so much.